Okay, hi, good morning, everybody. First, to announce the dedications for the entire year. The Tuesday Shir, this Tuesday Shir is sponsored by Rabbi and Sharon Auman in memory of their parents, Yonah ben Sadok and Esther Bas Raphael, and their son Rav Shmuel Elio Auman, Zechron Livracha. May all of the Shiurim be Le'ilui Nishmatam, and we're very, very grateful for the generous support. I thought I would take a little break. We're in the middle of a topic, but in light of the news and the like, I wanted to maybe give you one session on the halachic issues that involve prisoner releases and hostage exchanges. Now, granted, I don't think Netanyahu was consulting with too many rabbis on this. I certainly didn't get a phone call, but who knows? But it is an issue, and of course, this is not the first time that the state of Israel has to deal with this heartbreaking issue. We had Gilad Shalit story a few years ago. And before that, the truth is, even with Entebbe, at least initially, which was under consideration, was some type of prisoner exchange program. It happened to be, it was rendered moot by virtue of the very courageous and really miraculous Entebbe raid, where, as all of you know, Yoni Netanyahu, the Prime Minister's brother, lost his life in leading that particular raid. So it's a very, very difficult and emotional issue, and I'm going to be relatively dispassionate and objective here, but that certainly does not mean that I'm cold and unfeeling in terms of the human dimension. But I just want you to understand, perhaps many of you have looked at this already, so I apologize if what I say is not a chiddush necessarily, but I just want to go over the primary makor that deals with this particular problem. On one hand, we know there is a great, great mitzvah called pidyon shvuyin, people who are captive, people who are held against their will. There's a great mitzvah to ransom them, to free them, to get them out of their condition. Pidyon shvuyin is such an important mitzvah that we even sell a Sefer Torah or sell a shul to be able to have money to get pidyon shvuyin. Now, as a little aside, by the way, this is kind of a digression. What is the definition of a captive? Now, obviously, people who are held by Hamas as hostages are certainly captives. But the interesting question is, what if you have a Jewish person who actually committed a crime and he was tried by a court and was sentenced to jail? Whether it would be Jonathan Pollard, whether it would be Rubashkin. So the question would be, they committed a crime. Are they considered to be captive? Now, there is a story with Rav Moshe Feinstein, a very interesting story. And again, I'm not comparing Pollard and Rubashkin. I'll talk about that separately in a minute. But the story that went to Rav Moshe was, there was a member of the Frum community, I think in New York, who had a son who was convicted of cocaine dealing, drug dealing. And the person went to Rav Moshe. I'm not sure what Rav Moshe could have done, but they asked, could Rav Moshe write a letter? Could Rav Moshe make an appearance? Could Rav Moshe send somebody there to vouch for, the boy's a good character, he just fell in with the wrong people? And it is said, Rav Moshe looked at the man and said, your son ought to be in jail. What's the concept of it? Your son did things that were dangerous. Your son did things that endangered the lives of people. Maybe he even killed people. He says, there's nothing wrong with him being in jail, and there's no mitzvah to try to get him out of jail, as it were. Now, this is the story. Now, which suggests, in other words, that, criminals should be in jail. Now, obviously, the Pollard and Rubashkin situations are very, very different, because there you're dealing, number one, with nonviolent crimes, and indeed, in the case of Jonathan Pollard, the information that he gave was to a friendly ally of the United States, and indeed, there was information that the U.S. government should have turned over anyway. Even Rubashkin was guilty of things, but these are the types of things that you commonly get, 7 months in jail and $100,000 fine. To get whatever he got, a 25-year sentence, was so meshugana, so out of proportion. The average sentence for murder in the United States is 7 years. And somehow Rubashkin, because, and what was one of his crimes? One of his crimes was he overvalued his assets in a loan application to a bank. But he paid back the loan. The loan was paid back. The bank said, we don't care. We're not going to press charges. We got our money. But the government said, no, we have to prosecute fraud. So,
Trump has the same.
yeah, it's the same thing that Trump is going through. Meaning, you can't make a general statement, meaning some prison sentences are so unjust, so unfair, whether it's through anti-Semitism or other features, you don't really know. B'diuk. So at that point, that type of prisoner might be a shavui, and there's a mitzvah pidyon shavuyin. But when it comes to violent offenders who are really dangerous to other people, Moshe said that, they're not shavuyin. They're getting the punishment that they need or that they deserve. Now, that doesn't mean we don't try to provide them support, chizuk, whatever it would be. There's a wonderful organization, Chabad has, the Aleph organization, that actually works and helps Jewish prisoners, whether it's kosher food, whether it's learning, whether it's tefillin. Those things we should do. A Jew is still a Jew. Meaning, even if it's not pidyon shavuyin to get him out, we try to help him in whatever way we can, even if, there's always tshuva, etc. But you're not necessarily a shavui. But of course, to our sorrow, that is academic with respect to our hostages, because our chatufim are 1,000% shavuyim. So on one hand, there's a great, great mitzvah called pidyon shavuyin, and I see a sign, a banner, out that right near the show here that says, Ein lecha mitzvah gedolah ki pidyon shavuyin, and indeed Chazal call it mitzvah gedolah because it's pikuach nefesh and sexual abuse and all sorts of tragic things. But here's the problem. The problem is that when you secure the release of shavuyin in ways that do create danger for the general population, how do you strike the balance? Do you say, hey, I got 200 people there. I got to do whatever I can to save their lives, no matter what's going to be? Or do I say, well, wait a second here. I can't endanger, I shouldn't endanger potentially thousands of people. We already know that in the Gilad Shalit, which of course was a ratio of 1,000 to 1, I think, that one of the people, Sinwar, one of the terrorists who was released, was actually instrumental in planning the Hamas attack of the pogrom, as we call it, of October 7th. So this is really politically, emotionally, it is a heartbreaking decision, because how does a government official look a parent in the face and say, I'm sorry, we're not going to rescue your child because we're not going to release terrorists or whatever it would be? So let me just share with you the main halachic source. The main halachic source on this question is a Mishnah in Maseches Gittin, Daf Mem Hey, Amud Aleph, that says, Ein podin es hashvuyin yoser michtei demehem. This deals in the ancient world where people would be seized, just kidnapped. It's not a war situation necessarily. They were held to be sold as slaves, and Jewish communities would often ransom these people to free them from their slavery, meaning essentially they bought a slave, but of course they didn't hold him as a slave, they bought him just to get him free. So it mentions that you don't pay beyond their worth. Now, of course, what does that mean, beyond their worth? Life is infinite. But it actually means that slaves, in a slave market society, human beings had an economic value. How much would the normal price be for you? Now, that depends, of course, on your age, on your strength, on your talents, on your abilities, etc. Some people, would command a bigger price. Some people command a lesser price. So if the kidnappers are just demanding the standard price in the slave market, then you got to pay it. That's the mitzvah called pidyon shavuyin. But if they are demanding more than the standard slave market price, Chazal made a takana that you do not pay excessive ransoms beyond their market value. Now, the Mishnah does not, the Mishnah says, and the reason for this is tikkun olam. This is a rectification or an improvement or a takana for the benefit of society. But the Mishnah does not say what is the benefit of the society here. So the Gemara proceeds to explain that there are two possibilities. One is duchka de tzibura, And that is, we don't want communities to go bankrupt paying excessive ransoms. Every time somebody gets kidnapped, a community has to come up with $10 million or whatever, 40 million shekel. At some point, they're not going to have money for hospitals, for yeshivot, for roads, whatever, for everything that society needs. So therefore, Chazal exempted them from paying these excessive ransoms because it would deplete resources. That's reason number one. Duchka de tzibora, we don't want communities to impoverish themselves by paying these ransoms. The second reason is we don't want to encourage hostage takings in the future, which will endanger more and more people. Because if the kidnapper knows that they could get whatever they could possibly get, and we have to come up with the money, then, they'll give you the hostage, and then they'll take more people and more people and more people. So Chazal were concerned with the future dangers of giving in to the demands of kidnappers, meaning to say, we don't give in to those demands because of the dangers that would be occasioned by encouraging kidnapping. Now, the Gemara says there's a nafkamina, there's a practical difference here, and that is, and this may be very hard to swallow, can an individual who come up with his own resources? Meaning, here's the idea. Let's assume that the community is not being asked, but it happens to be that somebody's child, God forbid, was kidnapped. Again, we're not talking about Hamas yet. I'm just talking about routine kidnappers for slavery, and we'll come back to the modern situation that we're facing. Now, the community, if it's only a concern that a community should not deplete its resources, well, a private person can spend his money any way he wants. So if I want to spend my money to ransom my child, I'll spend my money to ransom my child. Who's going to tell me no? But here's the kicker. If you go with the second reason, that Chazal were concerned not to encourage or embolden future kidnappings, as strange as it sounds, the parent would not be allowed to pay an excessive ransom. Now, my guess is most parents wouldn't listen if they had the resources. So indeed, the Gemara gives the story about a certain person who paid a huge sum to get his daughter back. And the Gemara says, okay, he did it. Parents do what they do. But shelo b'ratzon chachamim. It was not in accordance with the will of the sages. So theoretically, there actually is a rule that even a parent is not allowed to pay an excessive ransom, but that's only like the second reason, meaning if you go with duchya de tzibora, communal resources, a yachid would be permitted. Like the second reason, even a yachid would not be permitted to do it. La halacha, I have to say, that the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch all paskin like the second reason, that our concern is not merely economic preservation of resources. Our concern is to shield the public from the danger of hostage takings or kidnappings over and over and over again. And therefore the halachic theory is, if the kidnapper knows they're not going to be able to make exorbitant profit, it's less likely that they'll do it in the future. And therefore this is the tikkun olam. Now, here is the thing. When you're dealing with not just, actually let me give you one example where this was actually carried out, la halacha. In the 13th century, 1200s, there was a very, very great rabbi who was considered to be among Ashkenazic Jews, the Gadol Hador Mamash, and this was Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, called Maharam Mirutenberg. And he was the Rebbe of the Rosh. He really was the true Gadol Hador of all Ashkenazi Jewry. And he was kidnapped. He was just held for ransom. It was no big deal. They just took him for ransom. And they demanded excessive money, a lot of money. And Marami Rittenberg instructed the Jewish community not to pay the ransom based on this principle in the Mishnah that you don't redeem captives more than their economic value. Now his own Talmud, the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, disagreed. And Rabbeinu Asher felt that we have an obligation to redeem Marami Rittenberg because he was the Gadol Hador. I'll talk about the Gadol Hador exception in a few moments. But the Maram had a very logical argument. If you consider me the Gadol Hador, how can you violate my psak, not your redeeming? Meaning, you're going to violate my psak based on me being the Gadol Hador. That's a logical contradiction. So Marami Rutenberg actually languished in a confinement for more than 7 years. He died in confinement. Now, Baruch Hashem, apparently his life was not in danger. I don't know why they wouldn't kill him, but Baruch Hashem, they just held him. And it was not it was bad, but it wasn't as bad as you might imagine. He was able to have Talmidim visit him. He was able to give shiurim. He was able to write some of his svarim and shuvot date from his captivity. So it was more like a kind of a house arrest. He was confined to a room, but in that room, he had the resources he needed to be able to live a Jewish life, but still, for 7 years, to be put into confinement. Yeah.
Does pikuach nefesh not?
I'll address it. I'll address it. Yeah. Now, what happened was when he died, he then died in captivity, and the captors were demanding a ransom to release his body. And here already, interestingly enough, since he was no longer alive, the Rush felt he could activate his psak, and there was an individual who paid, a very wealthy man, who paid to have the Marami Rutenberg's body released on the condition that when the man dies, he would be buried next to Marami Rutenberg. And indeed, in Germany, in Rottenburg, wherever that is, I don't even know where the city is, but where it is in the old Jewish cemetery. We still have the kever of Marami Rutenberg, and next to him is the person who paid the ransom to get him out of that captivity. So this was actually applied in practice. Now, when we apply this principle to hostage exchanges, on one level, this is even worse than the problem that the Gemara is concerned about. The Gemara was concerned with the problem that if we pay excessive ransoms, we are emboldening and encouraging more kidnappings in the future. Now, certainly that problem exists with prisoner exchanges as well, that they might as well take more Jewish hostages, but there's an additional problem that goes beyond that. And that is the release of the terrorists itself. It's not just they're going to kidnap more people. The terrorists who are being released can, God forbid, kill many Jews. In other words, if the Gemara has a problem, don't give in to the kidnappers because of future dangers. A hostage release or a prisoner release, whatever language you want to use, is even worse than simply paying ransom to the kidnapper. When I pay ransom to a kidnapper, so the problem is that may encourage kidnapping. And that's a problem here too. But here, in addition to the problem of encouraging kidnapping, we actually are releasing terrorists back into the population. So problem number one, again, I'm not giving a psak yet. In fact, I won't give a psak at all. But problem number one is a prisoner exchange program. Again, by the way, whether you call it a prisoner exchange or a hostage exchange, it's a funny semantic difference. I understand that Hamas likes to call it prisoner exchange, etc. But whatever it is, I'm not going to get into the semantics or the politically correct way of referring to these things. But the problem basically is that this is a violation of the rabbinic enactment of Ein Podinus Hashvuyin Yoser Michdei Demeim and Neitikun Olam, because it is creating dangers to the public as well as encouraging future hostage takings. So, what's the other side of this? So here's the thing. Tosfos asks a number of questions, and Tosfos gives a number of answers, and depending on the answer, you'll have some important differences about the legitimacy of these programs. The Gemara gives a story. In fact, there's a Gemara that everybody learns on Tisha B'Av, right? On Tisha B'Av, we're not allowed to learn regular Torah. So we learn those Gemaras that are sad or about the Korban Beis HaMikdash. So one of the famous passages that people learn is also in Maseches Gittin, and that's the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa and all of the different stories. So if you go far enough, sometimes people don't learn to the end of the story. There's a particular story that the Gemara says that Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania, this is in the aftermath of the Churban Beis HaMikdash, encountered a beautiful child, a child that even physically was very, very beautiful. And he had a sense that this was not physical beauty, but there was something very special about this child. And he gave him like a little test with a pasuk. He just shouted out, the kid was being sold as a slave or whatever it was, and he just shouted out half a pasuk to see if the child could respond with the other half of the pasuk. And this is a pasuk in, I think, Yeshayahu, Mi Nasan Meshisa Liakov, who put the Jewish people in plunder. And the pasuk ends, Halo Anochi Hashem, it's Hashem that did it because we didn't keep the mitzvos, and this is God's punishment. So Rabbi Yeshua said, who put Bnei Yisrael in plunder? And the child said, Halo Zu Hashem Chatanu Lo. So it's really two things. Number one, he knew the pasuk. And number two, he was affirming the idea of the pasuk, that everything is from Hashem. And we accept it, we don't complain, etc. We don't taina against Hashem. And Rabbi Yeshua said, Muftachani, I am very sure that this child will grow up to be a great, great Jewish leader, a great Talmid Chacham, and I will redeem him for whatever price is demanded. And it is said that he raised a huge amount of money to redeem this child. This is a story in the Gemara. So Tosfos asks the question that how could that be? The halacha is even an individual is not supposed to, according to the reason of not to encourage, even the individual is not supposed to pay an excessive ransom because you're encouraging hostage taking and the like. So how could Rabbi Yoshua violate the takana of the Chachamim of Ein Podin es Hashvuyin Yeser Michdei Demeya? So there are two different Tosasim, but they give a total of 3 answers. And these answers will make a big difference in our situation. Answer number 1, we will call the Gadol Hador exception. Meaning if somebody is an exceptionally great Torah scholar, or in this case, the potential to be an exceptionally great Torah scholar, all bets are off. You can do whatever you need to do. And therefore Rabbi Yoshua saw in this person, who indeed did become a great, great Talmid Chacham, Gadol, that he's worthy of being redeemed no matter what it is. So that would only apply to the, not necessarily Gadol Hador, but to someone who potentially will be a great Torah scholar. That is answer number 1. Answer number 2 is your point. That is, this was a situation of pikuach nefesh. Now this is a huge, huge exception to the rule of the Mishnah. Meaning, according to answer number 2, the rule that we don't pay excessive ransoms because we're worried about future problems only applies where the life of the hostages is not jeopardized. Where the life of the hostage, of the chatuf, is bisakana, the halacha is we do whatever we can because of pikuach nefesh. You'll ask me the obvious question. Why should the pikuach nefesh of the chatuf be more important than the pikuach nefesh of future people whose lives may be in danger? That's the obvious question. And the answer is because one is vadai and one is safek, meaning to say the people who are kidnapped, they are presently in a definitive danger. Their lives are in danger every single second. It's hard to believe, but you have to understand this. Every single second that they are in Hamas custody or whatever, in a captivity situation like that, that is vadai sakana. Now, to talk about the future dangers of releasing terrorists, they certainly do exist, but they are in the nature of speculative dangers. Maybe, the IDF or the Shin Bet or whatever it would be is going to stop them and the like. So as a result, there is a general rule according to this. Remember, this is only one answer. In other words, this is not a final answer. This is one answer. We apply the rule that those who are in vadai, definitive danger override speculative dangers that may or may not occur in the future. Now that's a huge hole, because that basically says that a Mishnah that looks like it's a general rule will actually apply in relatively few cases, like Rabbi Rottenberg would be a case like that. Because the vast majority of both kidnappings and certainly hostage takings is a pikuach nefesh situation.
Right.
According to this answer of Tosfos, the whole Mishnah is not going to apply in a pikuach nefesh situation. Now, but keep in mind, though, that the fact that Tosfos gave another answer for the Rabbi Yehoshua story indicates that pikuach nefesh, like that answer, would not be sufficient. And indeed, the Ramban says explicitly, the Ramban absolutely disagrees with Tosfos, and the Ramban says, even b'makom pikuach nefesh, even if that means the hostage is going to die, this is what the Ramban says, we do not redeem them in excess of their value, because we have to be concerned with danger to the public. So you have a clear machlokas between Tosfos and Ramban on this critical point. In many ways, although I'll give you another bit of reasoning a little later, in many ways this is the crux of the issue here, because we have chatufim who are in a definitive state of sakana, and we're going to secure their release by doing something that potentially may endanger the population. And again, this is in actually three different ways, in some ways. Number one, by releasing terrorists. Number two, by the ceasefire that gives, Hamas time to regroup. And of course, Hamas can play this forever. I mean, they could basically say, they could stretch this out for 6 months or more, and they could rebuild a lot of capacities within 6 months. And number three, it encourages future kidnapping. So there are three sakanot. I mean, they're all related. There is the release of the terrorists per se, who could be mechablim. There is the ceasefire, which gives them time. And there is the encouraging of the kidnapping. So if you go with the answer that for pikuach nefesh, we don't care about future dangers, we just look at the here and now, such a deal would be mutter. Not only mutter, it would be a mitzvah. If, on the other hand, you follow the Ramban's view that the takana of the chachamim is that we ignore even the sakana of the chatufim in order to save society from a future danger, this would be disallowed. So you see already that the halachic legitimacy of these types of exchange programs would be subject to the machlokas between Tosfos and the Ramban, how to understand the Rabbi Yishmael. Well, Rabbi Yishmael was the name of the rabbi, but Rabbi Yehoshua was the ransomer. Rabbi Yishmael was the kid who became Rabbi Yishmael later. That how do you understand the Rabbi Yishmael story? Do you carve it out as a narrow little exception for Gadol Hador? Or do you generalize it that whenever there's pikuach nefesh, we look at the present definitive danger and we don't consider the future dangers? And that does mean that the whole Mishnah is talking about a relatively uncommon case where the kidnapped victim's life is not in danger. And that's pretty rare. In fact, I don't even understand why Rabbi Rittenberg was not in danger. I mean, why wouldn't they kill him? I'm not sure exactly why. But in that type of case, that's when you apply the Mishnah. Of course, Rabbi Rittenberg rejected the Gadol Hador exception. That's what the Rush tried to do. Okay, so this is the issue. Now, I heard an interview, in a way it was kind of a little frightening, with Jonathan Pollard and Rav David Bar Chaim of Machon Shiloh. Rav David Chaim is a very, very interesting fellow. An Orthodox rabbi, a Talmud Chacham, but really a maverick, kind of a little unusual in many, many ways. And Jonathan Pollard said that the hostage release thing, the prisoner exchange, whatever you want to call it, was absolutely wrong. He says Israel has lost the war. He said every chayal that will be killed from this day forward is for nothing, because we have lost the war by giving in, by a ceasefire. He made the claim that if all the hostages do get released, and of course we pray that it should be the case, the U.S. is going to tell Israel, what are you fighting for? You you got what you want. And he said, when you're fighting a war, and I'll come to that, when you're fighting a war, you got to not stop until you achieve a military objective. He was absolutely against putting pictures of the hostages there. And he said a national emergency should have been declared. I'm quoting him, this is not me talking. And he said that the families should have been ordered not to make any public statements. And if they refuse to comply, he said, round him up and throw them in prison. It was hard to even hear those words.
Wow.
But that's what he said. And he gave a dimion. When he was in the Navy, he learned that if you're in a submarine and there's a leak in, let's say, the back half of the submarine, and the submarine is going to sink, you have to seal off the back half, even if that means there are a bunch of people stuck who can't leave that part of the submarine for whatever reason, and they're going to die. He says you have to do that to save the lives of the rest of the people. He said we have a similar type of problem. How do you look in the eyes of a parent who is saying, what are you doing for my son or daughter? And your answer is, I'm sorry, they're going to have to die because of our military objective of destroying Hamas. Very, 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 very difficult. But once again, though, the bottom line to all of this is, although I'll mention one counter-argument, is that according to one answer of Tosfos, this is a legitimate procedure, because the people who are chatufim are vadai sakana. There's pikuach nefesh, and even though we're doing pikuach nefesh in a way that is potentially endangering future people, but that potential danger is speculative and unknown. And according to this answer of Tosfos, you have to look at your actual danger, and that trumps the potential danger. And Ovadia Yosef, Zichrono Livracha, he's not alive now, but with the Gidon Shalit, he actually approved the Gidon Shalit transaction. They say Rabbi Yashiv did as well. So many poskim follow this Tosfos. There were, however, others who took the position, like the Ramban, that the larger protection of society requires that people be endangered if that's necessary. Now, what's interesting is that the state of Israel in the past has not only released terrorists for people who are alive, they've released terrorists for dead bodies. So the question that's interesting is, even if you go with Tosfos, that we're allowed to pay excessive ransoms for pikuach nefesh, would there be a heter to pay excessive ransoms when someone's already dead, but for kavod hamet, to get a dead body back? It's not clear at all that there is a halachic heter for that, because the heter was for the chai and not for the met. Marami Rittenberg, who they did pay excessive ransom, but once again, that fell within the Gadol Hador exception. By the way, it's interesting, with Entebbe, not Entebbe, or earlier than Entebbe, you may remember in the early years of hijacking. So there was a flight of Jews that was hijacked, and Rav Hutner was on the flight, not Entebbe, this was before Entebbe. In Jordan, yeah. So obviously we were worried about all the Jews, but there was a special worry about Rav Hutner, Rosh Hashiva, one of the Gedolei Hador. So there was some attempt at some point to try to, when they were not willing to release everybody, to try to secure a special release for Rav Hutner. Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky said, that's not proper. So I always wonder, a bit of a joke, when Baruch Hashem, Rav Hutner was released, what was his relationship with Rav Yaakov? Rav Yaakov said, don't release. But I'm sure everything was fine, because if that was the halacha, then, that was the halacha. But that was a similar type of discussion. Now, I do want to point out that Rav Yaakov said another point, though. Rav Yaakov made the following point, which really ties into Jonathan Pollard. Rav Yaakov said,
all of the discussion that you can do things for pikuach nefesh and the like is not relevant to war. He said he differentiated between kidnappings and acts of war. He said, okay, in kidnappings, some guy is kidnapping to hold for money, so if it's pikuach nefesh, I can pay ransoms. Those are private issues that may endanger the public in the future, so we're makel. But he said, when you have a milchemet mitzvah to protect the Jewish people and Eretz Yisrael, then you're obligated to destroy the enemy or disable the enemy. And there, he made the following point. This is Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky. This is years ago. The same way a chayal, right, pikuach nefesh. I mean, let's assume that a chayal is sent to Gaza. So he says, I'm sorry, I can't go because it's pikuach nefesh. You're telling me to endanger my life? What does that mean? Right? Well, the answer is simple, that when it's a milchama, we are mechuyev to put our lives at risk. That's what milchama means. So, the same way a chayal may potentially have to give his life, or any of us, in order to maximize the success of the military effort, there is sometimes the notion of what you might call an involuntary chayal. Meaning, somebody is a prisoner, somebody is a hostage. But if, by securing their release, we are frustrating the war effort, then in a sense, they would be part of the chayalim that would be moser nefesh. Now, this is a different argument, meaning Rav Yaakov is arguing that even if we would accept Tosfos's rule, that for pikuach nefesh we could normally pay ransom, he said a wartime situation is different, because in wartime we are commanded to put our lives at risk in order to advance the military objective. And this would include chayalim. Now, let me give you an example where, I'm sorry, not chayalim, chatufim. Let me give you an example where this is undoubtedly the case. One major issue in all wars is what is euphemistically called collateral damage. And this is getting Israel in trouble all the time. Now Israel, to its great credit, and sometimes even to the detriment of the military objective, goes to amazing lengths, much more than the United States. I mean, listen, I didn't notice in Nagasaki and World War II and Dresden and all of those things any particular great concern for hundreds of thousands of civilians who got hurt. But Israel has leaflets and SMS messages and individual telephone calls. Get them out of here. And of course, keep in mind that Hamas didn't issue any advance warnings on October 7th saying, get out of this concert. We're going to be, murdering some people here. Hamas tends not to give us that courtesy. And of course, when Israel warns civilians, they're also warning Hamas that we're coming, so Israel does it. So it is really, really true that the IDF, and this is to the great credit, some people are critical of it because they say, it's emboldening the enemy, but to its great credit, there's a tremendous reverence for life, not just our lives, but the lives of the other side too. Golda Meir made an infamous statement, and don't attack me because I'm not endorsing the whole statement, but I'm endorsing half of the statement. She said, the first half I do not endorse, but she did say, we can forgive the Arabs for killing our children. I don't accept that. But then she said, we can't forgive them for making us kill their children. There is a truth in that. Judaism is not pacifistic. We don't believe in turning the other cheek. It is very, very clear. Somebody's coming to kill you or your family or your people. You kill them if necessary. Absolutely. You kill them. That's a mitzvah. Milchemet mitzvah. But you don't do it with joy. You don't do it with happiness. You don't do it with dancing in their blood. You do it with sadness. You do it with regret. And you look for every possible way not to have to do it. And that's a very big difference in morality. And that is, just as, and we learn it from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, by the splitting of the Red Sea, right? So the Egyptians are drowning, and the Malachei Hashares want to sing to Hashem, and Hashem says, my creatures, the Egyptians, are drowning in the sea. It is not a time for joy. Now, keep in mind that God didn't say, oh, these are my creatures. How can I drown them? He drowned them because they had to be destroyed. But Hashem says, it's not something to celebrate. We don't celebrate. Even with Purim, by the way, they make the point that, the Jews killed their enemies on the 13th of Adar, and they rested on the 14th. And we celebrate the holiday of Purim on the 14th, or 15th. In Shushan, it was, a day later. Now, it's been pointed out, we don't celebrate the day of a military victory. We don't celebrate the day that we destroyed our enemies. We celebrate the days of peace, the days of shalom. Okay? So this is a very big difference. So on one hand, Israel is, to their credit, even though the IDF is not a religious institution per se, but I think they're animated. They are pretty much animated by Jewish values. I think it's part and parcel of the blood, so to speak. Now, the thing is, collateral damage is, though, unavoidable after you give the warnings, after you give the leaflets, after you make the phone calls. And Hamas puts itself in hospitals and puts itself in schools and puts itself, in residential areas. And that's where they build the tunnels and they have human shields of their own people. If in order to get them, those other people are hurt, regrettable, sad, tragic, but necessary. So here is the thing that I even hate to say, but based on Rav Yaakov's pshat. If it becomes necessary for civilians to die in order to get Hamas, not only would it be permitted for Palestinian people, but even if, God forbid, it should never happen, it would be Jewish people that would be dying in that course. They would be like chayalim. This is the concept of the involuntary chayal. A chayal must be willing to risk his life. So too anybody, if that's necessary for the war effort. So therefore, the bottom line is that Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky opined that whatever heter there is for pikuach nefesh in a private kidnapping, so to speak, would not apply in time of war, where people have to assume the risks of their lives, like chayalim, in order to secure the military objective. So, b'kitzur, we actually have three different views about this. We have the view that simply says usur, because the Mishnah says that you have to be concerned with future dangers, meaning even in a private kidnapping, you cannot be poda even for pikuach nefesh unless it's gadol hador, and that is the shita of the Ramban. Meaning, according to Ramban, you could not pay. You're not going to ask the shaila, but you cannot pay to get your daughter ransomed from a kidnap if it's excessive. That's Ramban. The other extreme is Tosfos, that b'makom pikuach nefesh everything is mutter. And then there's a middle view that differentiates between wartime hostage takings and private kidnappings. That even if private kidnappings, pikuach nefesh trumps everything, when you're dealing with wartime, everybody has to be willing to endanger their lives if necessary for the military success, and therefore a hostage would be treated as a soldier in time of war, in which we try to get them out if it doesn't endanger, but if it would endanger the military effort by releasing terrorists, then essentially they would have to be sacrificed. This was Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky's position. I think Rav Hershel Schechter of YU, a very big Talmud Chacham, takes the same position. I'm not here to paskin on this. As I say, I could not look a parent in the eye and say your child has to be sacrificed. And I think the bottom line is that the government's decision does have some halachic backing. And indeed, Rav Adi Yosef approved similar things, and Rav Elyashiv. So to me, that
wasn't during war. Shalit was not during
Shalit
war.
was not during war. You're correct. So maybe the war might change. Yeah, you're correct. Yeah. Yeah.
How do we understand the tefillah of Yashir?
Yeah, so the question is a very good question. The question is that the angels were told in Shemayim that they should not sing to God, they should not rejoice, because the Egyptians are drowning, and we don't rejoice when any human life is taken. But the question is, so the angels were told not to sing, but the Jewish people themselves, right after that, was Oz Yashir. They sang a song of triumph. I mean, isn't it the same problem? Hey, what are you rejoicing? What are you singing Oz Yashir if the enemy drowned? So that is a very good question. And some want to differentiate, which may have relevance here, between people who actually benefit. In other words, the angels are just celebrating something that didn't happen to them. But when something happens to you, there's hakarat hatov, and hakarat hatov permits you to be grateful to God. But on the other hand, I admit to you, I have a little difficulty with that answer, because if Oz Yashir would be written as thanks to God for saving us, then that's certainly a valid distinction. But there's no question Oz Yashir does talk about death and destruction, meaning Oz Yashir is not only phrased in terms of thank you, you took us from life, from death to life. It is, they drowned like an Evan, etc. So the teretz is a little difficult. But as I say, the standard answer that's given is that hakarat hatov does allow you to celebrate. Yeah.
In the past, you talked about the halacha of sacrificing one or a few for the benefit of the many. How does that apply here?
Yeah, so that's certainly does apply here, and indeed, this would be the underlying basis in which, if the many are going to be endangered, so perhaps the few have to be sacrificed. In other words, that's exactly, I think, Rav Yaakov's point in time of war, that just like Chayalim, right? The Baruch Hashem, the number of Chayalim who will die is relatively small, but they're dying to protect a larger entity. So the Chatutim would fall under the same rule. But again, as I say, others argue Vadai versus Safek. In fact, let me mention a few variations of this particular problem. Let me talk about for a moment, this is totally out of left field, but it is going to be connected. The problem of the poison pill. I'm not sure if the Army does this, but I know they were talking about this. This is where, let's assume that you're a chayal, and you have information about security, Israeli security, the whereabouts of troops, etc. And there is a fear that under torture, the torture may be so unbearable that you will reveal information that may endanger other people. So there was talk, I honestly don't know if they do this, of giving people a cyanide pill, which, that's what Nazis, a lot of Nazi war criminals, Hermann Goering, took a cyanide pill to avoid I'm not sure what he gains. I guess maybe it's less painful than being hung, and the like. It's always struck me though that when someone is on death row, they watch him so meticulously to be absolutely sure he doesn't kill himself. It's not. I mean, they really do 24/7. Suicide watch or whatever it is, even though he's going to be killed the next day. They got to be sure that we're going to do it. He doesn't do it to himself. But okay. So here's the interesting question. Halachically, is a soldier allowed to commit suicide if he feels that through torture he's going to endanger the lives of other people? Now, committing suicide is a very big avera. So I think the halacha is he's allowed to commit suicide for the following reason. You can kill a rodef, right? You can kill somebody that's endangering the lives of others. So, for example, let's imagine that I see a Jewish guy who under torture is about to reveal information that will endanger other people's lives. I could shoot him. So, l'chara, if the person feels that he's going to endanger other lives, he can paskin that he's a rodef.
He's
And
his own road there.
he's his own road. He's a rodef, right? And therefore, he can kill himself, just as somebody else could kill him, and the like. So I think that is a possibility. But what's interesting is this does not mean that torture is an independent basis for suicide. In other words, that's another question. Meaning, can a person kill themselves because torture is so excruciating? That is a separate halachic question. That may be a hedger. But this is a different nuance. This is not, I'm killing myself to avoid the torture. I'm killing myself to avoid endangering the lives of others. That's a different type of cheshbon. And there, for sure, I think it would be mutter, even if killing to avoid torture might not be. But that's a separate issue. Some people will allow that. That's actually relevant with euthanasia. In other words, can a person commit suicide if they're suffering excruciating, unrelenting pain that cannot be treated? It's a separate issue. I'm not going to go into that issue today. Now, another issue that comes up, I'm just bringing up some miscellaneous issues, is killing a terrorist once the terrorist is in custody. Now, this is a big question. You may remember there was a YouTube video, there was an actual case of a chayal where a terrorist was disabled and lying down on the ground, and the chayal just went over to him, put a gun to his head, and shot him. Now, the facts are in dispute. The chayal argued that the terrorist was reaching for a gun. So the facts, or whatever the facts are, I have no idea. But let's assume in principle, just for hypothetical, that the terrorist does not have access to a weapon, the terrorist is in Israeli custody, etc. Would you be allowed to kill a terrorist once the terrorist is disabled?
I vote.
So, well, I'm not really holding it out for a vote, but okay. So the pashtus of the halacha would be that you cannot, because the yesod of killing a terrorist is not to punish him for his bad behavior. It's to prevent him. That's rodef. Rodef is not punishment. It's very important to understand that. That's why I had mentioned that a rodef can be a baby that's crying and giving away your whereabouts. A rodef can be a good Jew who is being tortured, who's going to reveal information. In other words, rodef is not about being a bad guy.
About a fetus.
That's correct. A fetus who endangers the mother's life, the Rambam says, is a rodef. So it's very important to understand, rodef is not about punishing. Rodef is about preventing harm. And once the harm is no longer going to be perpetrated by this individual person, there's no law of rodef. Now, this is pashtus, and yet the funny thing was, again, I'm not going to prove anything from this, but there was an interview with somebody from Hatzalah who met with Rav Chaim Kanevsky. Now, this is the guy talking, not Rav Chaim Kanevsky talking. And he asked Rav Chaim Kanevsky a shaila, what if a terrorist is brought for medical treatment and a Jew is brought for medical treatment and the terrorist is more seriously hurt, so under triage you would go to the terrorist first. Do you go to the Jew first or the terrorist first? So Rav Chaim Kanevsky said something that shocked the guy. Oh, of course you go to the terrorist first. So the guy was a little shocked. And Rav Chaim said, let me explain. You go to the terrorist first, you shoot him in the head, says, and then you take care of the Jew. Now, I don't know if this was meant as a joke. And the truth is, you can't even, rely on these secondhand reports. But in theory, at least, if I take it seriously, Rav Chaim was basically saying, you can kill a terrorist that's in a hospital. Now, of course, suffice it to say, the other side would certainly do that to us. But that's a given. But that's we don't define our behavior by their behavior.
When they're brought to trial, that they can give them the death sentence.
Oh, okay. So let me differentiate. There is no question that it is legitimate to give terrorists a death sentence. That's not the question. Meaning, for sure. I'm in favor of it. I'm in favor of a death sentence for terrorists. But that's after they're tried by a court. Meaning, if we're talking about vigilantism, so vigilantism is mutter to prevent the guy from killing. Right? I don't have to go to a basin before I shoot the rodef. But on the other hand, once he's in custody, you got to have a judicial process, right? So that's going to be the problem. So I'll leave it for next week a little bit. But this is the issue: what possible heter would there be to kill a terrorist without a court proceeding, based on the laws of Rodef, which seemingly don't apply? Yeah, I think it's time to digest something. Yeah, thank you.
Did you read about the